Good evening, and welcome to today's edition of Keeping It Real with Rammona. Today, I have with me a very special guest. His name is Vikram Kapur. Hi, Vikram.
Hi, Rammona. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing fine. Glad to be here.
So glad to have you here today. I'm looking forward to a very interesting conversation with you. I'm just going to
So
take a
am I.
minute and introduce Vikram. So Vikram is the author of 3 novels actually. One of them is called The Assassins, which was published in 2017. There's also The Wages of Life in 2004 and Time is a Fire, which is published in 2002. He's also edited an anthology, 1984, In Memory and Imagination. His short fiction and non-fiction have been published in India and abroad in many notable publications, which include, among others, World Literature Today, Litro, New Writing, the Dublin Quarterly, Huffington Post, the Times of India, the Hindu, and Frontline. He's also taught journalism and creative writing in the United States and the UK. His short stories have been shortlisted in several international competitions, including, among the others, the Commonwealth Short Story Prize. For his writing, he's actually received fellowships for residencies in the US and Spain. And currently, he's a professor of English at Shiv Nadar University. So again, Vikram, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for being here today. So Vikram, I thought we'll start the conversation by talking about, probably a novel, which is the first one that I mentioned. I wanted to, ask you to share that. What was the reason? What was the inspiration behind this Assassinations?
Okay.
Why did you write that particular novel?
Yeah, one of the themes that I've written about a lot is the 1984 anti-Sikh pogrom in basically in Delhi. That's the one I really focused on. And that particular novel, focuses on that theme. Now, it's a theme into which I've returned to at regular intervals, certainly in my longer stuff, and to some extent in my shorter stuff as well. And this and it's a theme that's resonated with me for a number of years. The reason that I guess, if I had to put myself under a Freudian lens or something like that, I would just say that, it's the historic, it's one of the big historical events, or certainly the only big historical event to which I have personally been witness, because I was a teenager in 1984, and I saw how it affected life, how things changed, how it affected people. It resonated for me years later, in 2001, when I was in America, and it was after 9/11. And after 9/11, everybody with a brown face became a potential terrorist, in America. It was as if you suddenly woke up one morning and found that you were the bad guy, and you really didn't know why. And that's what made me think of what must have happened in 1984 to many Sikhs who the reason is that, if you grew up in India, you knew that the Muslim was the other. I mean, it was something that could have been handed down to you by your parents, which was something which was out in society. But there never had been such a big any problem between the Hindu and Sikh communities, even during partition and afterwards. And it just seemed that, the whole fabric of India, what we call it, the secular fabric of India, felt that it was so crackable that within a few years, two communities that had never really had been at odds with each other could find themselves on both sides of a chasm, in that speaking, and were at odds with each other. So I think that has been the that has been the inspiration, all along. And I think the Assassinations also sort of builds on that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on that. But I think when you're talking about say you said that you made a statement saying, it was kind of handed down that the Muslim was the other. That is kind of what, other people might have had that point of view. It's not necessarily we as individuals who hold that point of view, right? And what you're saying is that in
Well,
1984,
no, I mean in the society which was there at the time, and this came
correct.
right after partition. There was such a mistrust between the two communities,
Yeah,
and when you thought of communal riots, when you read about them, they were pretty
yeah,
much Hindu-Muslim affairs, until
yeah,
the 1980s, and there was always a vestige of mistrust, and
yeah,
this
yeah,
whole tendency to equate Muslims and Pakistan as one entity, in
yeah,
that sense,
yeah,
and to
yeah,
doubt, say, a Muslim's loyalty to India. So that's something that you grew up with, you knew about. That's what I was
yeah.
talking about.
Understood. And I mean, I know you mentioned 9/11. I was in the US as well, when 9/11 happened. And I mean, I have to be honest, I didn't really myself feel impacted by it. I mean, I know you've talked about how, there were anybody who had brown skin, would be suspect, or, would definitely be looked at more closely, say, while taking a flight. I mean, I know, that's an experience a lot of my friends had, for example. But
Mm.
I somehow was never subject to it myself. I mean, I never encountered, that sort of
No, but
discrimination.
yeah.
But by and large, yeah, I mean, I know that, it impacted a lot of people. And like I said, lots of my friends, did see that even though they were being told they're random checks, they weren't really that random any longer, it
No, you
was
see,
kind of targeted.
I, I agree with you. What something like this does is,
Yeah,
like even if it impacts you peripherally or marginally as an individual, but you
yeah,
see, you also live in a society, and what's
yeah,
going on in a society has a psychological impact on you. I mean, you may be wary about going to certain places. You might think, you might be more careful when you want to, for instance, get onto a flight.
yeah,
You
yeah,
might be you might pack your bag a lot more carefully, and
yeah.
all that stuff. You might not want to say certain things to people at certain times. So this is the kind of the knock-on impact that something like this does,
Sure.
to you.
Sure. And I mean, it's sad because, I think um, growing up in that atmosphere, I was a young child, during that period. And I have my own memories from that time, growing up. So, that time I think impacted so many people in so many different ways. So it's interesting that, that kind of became a theme for some of your work. So tell me, what is it that drove you to actually take to writing? What
Oh,
inspired you to become a writer? You've been writing for a long time now,
yeah.
and some of your work is, spectacular. I think even your columns that come out, you had some that came out recently. I mean, you write really, really well. But I was curious
Thank
to
you.
know, what is it that inspired you to start writing?
I tried very hard not to write. That's the
Really?
fact.
Why do
Oh
you say
yeah,
that?
I mean, well, writing. I thought writing was tough. It was very competitive. It was a lot of people at the bottom and a very few number of people at the top of the pyramid. I mean, as the American writer Raymond Carver said, there are far easier ways to make a living. And so for those reasons, I tried for a long time not to write. But I
Okay.
think you have the passion for something, and that's where your heart is. There comes a point where you have to listen to your heart, and go ahead with it, and all the practical arguments, I mean, fall astray, because they can't they can't really stand up when the heart wants something really badly. Just like being in love, it's a bit like that in that sense. I
That's
mean,
true.
love may be totally wrong for you, but it's hard not to swoon when the moment comes.
That's
In
true.
that
So,
sense,
yeah.
go on. Yeah.
Sorry. I was saying, so is writing something you started in school itself, or was that something you picked up later?
No, actually, I only really got into it when started getting interested in it when I was in college in America in
Okay.
university. Because,
All right.
because at that time in India, uh, there weren't the libraries, there weren't the big collections of books, there weren't the
Uh-huh.
clubs, there wasn't a tradition of readings and lit fests and all that other stuff which would
So,
get you into something like that. In America, there were, and especially if on a campus, there were thousands of opportunities. And America as a whole, the country had a well-developed literary culture. So that's
so,
when I really got into it. I was a reader before I went to America. That's true. I was an avid reader, but
okay.
really thought of writing, but I really got into that thing in America. Yes, that's true.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. So tell me, you've written several short stories. I was curious to know. I mean, I've read some of them, but obviously not all. Are there some specific
Mhm.
themes you have as far as the
Yeah, in short
short
stories,
series go?
yeah, in short stories, my themes are far more diverse. I've written
Okay.
some, like the novels. Basically, they have dealt with the theme of the political impinging upon the personal.
All
How
right.
a political event sort of changes or impacts the life of an ordinary individual.
Sure.
But in the short stories, the themes are much more diverse. I mean, some of them are the political impinging on the personal, but there's also stories about love, stories about siblings, stories about relationships between parents and their kids. Things so it's been far more diverse in that sense, and while I would say my novels have been serious, throughout, there also have been stories that are playful, stories that are comic, in
Uh-huh.
nature. So
Okay.
even the treatment of the story is has
Yeah.
been more diverse in that sense. Yeah.
Got it. So tell me, Vikram, I was curious to know that, uh, especially in your non-fiction, do you sometimes base your characters on real life, individuals? How
Uh,
does that work for you?
Well, in non-fiction, I've only written two sorts. I've
Okay.
written some essays, some of them
Okay.
on writing itself. The
Okay.
other non-fiction I've written is memoir,
Okay.
basically. And a
All
lot
right.
of the memoir has been based on my family, my immediate
Uh-huh.
family. And
Okay.
a lot of it is based on the theme of loss, losing loved ones. Because my parents have passed on, my elder brother has passed on.
Yeah.
So at that
Yeah.
time, in that moment, what were my feelings at that time?
Yeah.
Dealing with were the ones that I've captured, because I mean, the loss of loved ones and getting acquainted with death,
Yeah.
is a big thing in anybody's life.
Yeah, I know it does impact us on a very deep level. So I know when you go through loss and
Yeah.
you lose people that you
Well,
care about,
well,
you love.
nothing prepares you for it.
That's true. I agree with you on that. And what about your fiction? Are those characters based on real life individuals? You draw inspiration from people you meet or people
Uh,
you
some of
encounter?
them, some of
Okay.
them, yes. Unfortunately,
You,
these days we are stuck in homes most of the time, so you can't
yeah,
really go out and watch people.
yeah,
Writers are big warriors, so where they go, they watch everybody. They're always on the lookout for the interesting character, the interesting character trait, the
yeah,
interesting face, all
yeah.
that sort of stuff. So some of them certainly, but a lot of inspiration I've got is when I've been reading books or watching movies. It's something in there triggers some thought in you or triggers an
Uh-huh.
idea in you, and sometimes
Yeah,
you just follow that particular idea. So I mean, if anybody is listening who is a wannabe writer or wanting to follow this particular thing, the first
Yeah.
piece of advice I will give them is that be an avid reader. You know,
Okay.
a good writer, first you got to be a good reader.
That's good advice. So I have some comments here. There are lots of hellos, but I'm just going to share, some of these. Isha says, great to have two wonderful, special people. Then Aditya's also watching, and he sent us some icons.
Yeah.
Tanveer says, hi there, nice to see both of you. And Kamal Jean says, I'm glad you started writing. You write so well, Vikram. So I just thought I'll quickly share some of those comments. I recall you were telling me that there was, something you were writing about, and it was like based on a shopkeeper, that kind of form part of what you were writing about, and how you
Yeah.
actually went out and observed. So can you share a little about that? That was interesting.
Yeah, this is something I'm writing at the moment. And
Uh-huh.
one of the settings and one of the characters in it is a person who runs a general merchant shop, you know.
Yeah. Okay.
We've all been to general merchant shops, we've all bought things from them, but going
Sure.
and buying from them is very different from sitting and writing them. So, I would go to a general merchant shop and hang around there as unobtrusively as possible, and
Uh-huh.
try to observe as much as I could about the place as well as the people who worked in that particular place, and
Okay.
listen to the way spoke to each other, to get their dialogue right and to sort of evoke those people well. And I tried to be as unobtrusive as possible, but I think they got on to me and they would be staring at me. So then I would make myself scarce and then return, say, sometime
Another
later.
day.
And and also I made it a point to buy something. So
Okay.
they
So
didn't
there must
feel
be
that
like
I was just
this person frequents and watches and hangs around, but
yeah.
he's creating
I don't know.
creating a
I
sale.
mean, yeah, in India especially, you're not used to people staring at you, and everything, and certainly not
I think
shopkeepers. So they're
I
wondering,
I
they're
can
wondering, is he planning to steal something? Is he a thief or something?
I don't agree with you on that, Vikram. People stay all the time, and
Okay, I agree.
I,
Okay, maybe
I don't
no. Men,
I
men
don't
are
think
not, men are not used to being stared at. Women is a different matter.
that might be true. I don't
Okay.
know. Okay, there's a comment here by Jyotika which I wanted to share. She says Vikram's absolutely correct on it. Death plays emptiness in one's lives, and it takes a while for one to get over the grief. Yeah, I mean, Jyotika, I know that's true, but I think it's great because some people say that when you are impacted by something which is something difficult to deal with, everyone has a different way of dealing with it. Maybe for you, that writing in a sense was like a healing journey for you as well, because we have to find our
Perhaps,
own ways to deal with it. So
perhaps, yeah,
Adya
I'm sure
Prasad
it
here
was.
says, have read your books, Dr. Kapoor. You write so well. It's been a privilege to have been your MA
He was one of
student.
my
Always
students.
okay. Awesome. I'm glad your student is here and listening to this
Well, she's a
conversation.
former. Well, she's a former student. Good for her. Good for her to
Our
be here.
student,
Yeah,
okay.
that she
Wonderful.
remembers all these years later. That's good.
That's wonderful. So tell me, you've been teaching also for many years now. So is it actually possible to teach creative writing, Vikram? I'd love for you
It's
to talk about
possible.
that.
Yeah, it's possible to teach creative writing. It's not possible to teach people to write well. You know,
Okay.
uh, that depends on their talent, on their discipline, on their motivation, all that stuff. You can't really implant those things in people. you know what you can
Yeah.
do is you can teach them the basic nuts and bolts of plot, story, dialogue, structure, background, all that sort of stuff, which are the nuts and bolts of writing. But you certainly can't find their themes for them, find their characters for them, find their stories for them, or give and or implant inspiration in them, to evoke all of that. So that you can't do. It's the same thing when people teach music, same thing when people teach art. Now, what you can do is that you can be a good mentor to them because it's more
Sure.
like a mentorship as opposed to a traditional classroom lecture, sort of stuff. So you can guide them in a way that you can bring a critical focus and a critical point of view to that, and sort of
Sure.
advise them in a way that fine tunes the work and makes it better. But the basic work they have to do themselves. So that's why I say, I mean, it's possible to teach, but probably not possible to teach them to do it well in that sense.
Yeah, true. That's true. So Afshin says it's important for us to find an outlet to deal with our loss and grief. Yeah, Afshin, that's absolutely right. And it's different for all of us how we do that. Jyotika wants to know what is creative writing. Please enlighten us. So can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, there are three. Yeah, there are three aspects to creative writing. I mean,
Okay.
there's poetry, there's prose, and then there's script writing, of course.
Okay.
Now, poetry, I think, is self-explanatory, and also, okay, poetry is self-explanatory. I mean,
Yeah.
prose, there are two kinds of prose. One is fiction, where you make it up, and the other is non-fiction, where you're not supposed to make it up, although some people make up non-fiction also and pass off fiction as
Uh-huh.
non-fiction. That's also done
Okay.
quite. I mean,
Yeah.
and then there's script writing, which essentially is either playwriting or screenplay writing,
Uh-huh.
and so the difference is script writing is different from poetry and fiction, and non-fiction, because poetry and prose, sorry, because poetry and prose are written to be read, you know.
Okay.
Scripts are written to be performed, whether it's
Uh-huh.
on stage or it is on the screen in that sense. So
Okay.
it is so you're writing for a very different audience when you're writing
Yeah.
all three.
Understood.
In a nutshell
Thank you
is
for
creative
sharing.
writing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So, Vikram, tell me, you briefly touched upon the fact that, you tried not to become a writer, but, I wanted you to share a little bit about, maybe we can talk a little bit more about that because, there are many people, even if they're young or they're older, sometimes, a person is yearning for that creative, outlet. And a lot of times people stick to traditional jobs or what they've been doing, for the longest time because of fear of, trying
Mhm.
something different. What is the advice that you
Yeah.
can give someone, and not necessarily someone who wants to be a writer, but someone who just wants to follow a creative field? Is there any advice, because you've been in this field for so long? What is the
Yeah,
advice that
that's
you'd give people?
Yeah, that's a huge problem, especially in our country and in our culture, in our safety first, sort of mindset.
Yeah.
And even when you're teaching creative writing, you run into a lot of this, like you get a lot of students, for instance, who are doing engineering, but have neither the aptitude nor the interest in engineering, would rather prefer to do something creative, but they
Sure.
have parents who are pushing them into engineering because they feel that engineering is the way to a safe job.
Of course.
Something
Yeah.
about business administration, things like that. See, I see the advice that I would give anybody who wants to do something creative is do it if you simply can't stop yourself from doing it. If you love it that much, then that's the only reason that it's worth it.
Okay.
If you're going to do it, if and while doing it, of course, you should try to get the maximum out of your talent, rise as much as you possibly can, but do not but I think that should be the initial motivation. It's if you go into something like this with the initial motivation completely of achieving fame and fortune, and that's their only motivation, then I think it may not be the right may not be the right person for it, in that sense. See, with writing, everybody who wrote before they wrote for an audience or wrote to sell on simply loved to write because they loved words. That's the basic thing. It's just
Yeah.
like,
True.
somebody who becomes a cricketer or somebody becomes a soccer player, the first time they kick a football or they hit the ball with a cricket bat, they're not thinking of becoming, they're not planning, and they should not be anyway, thinking of Tendulkar or Ronaldo or something like that. They should do it for the pure joy of doing it. And then, as you develop, when the things come, then you can think of going in that sense. But if you do it this way, because see, in every creative field, 99.9% of the time, unless you have, if unless you're a second generation in that field and you have a father or a mother who is really well established in that field, like
Sure.
you're a star kid or something like that, who can really push you and put you on top, you're going to put up with a lot of rejection, you know and that's true of 99.9% of anybody who has tried to put up something creative. and
Uh-huh.
sometimes the and sometimes the rejection goes on for us for some time. I'll just this is not a right, since you asked about creative field, this is
Yeah.
just an example. This is just an
Sure.
example from acting.
Okay.
There's something called the Actors Studio in New York, which is the
Okay.
great training facility for American actors and actors worldwide. There are two or three actors I can think of: Gene Hackman, Harvey Keitel, and Dustin Hoffman. And if you think
Uh-huh.
about the American actors in the latter half of the 20th century, these three would make the top 10 list of anybody, in that sense. Now, Gene Hackman flunked 10 times before he got accepted by the writer's studio. Dustin
Wow.
Hoffman 12 times, Harvey Keitel
Oh my God.
13 times. I mean,
Really?
and you're talking of the big name actors. This is not guys playing
Sure.
bit parts, stuff like that. But then they had the passion and the persistence for it. So I think if you don't have the passion, I don't think you're going to have the persistence or the
Okay.
determination.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. I mean, I
Yeah,
agree with you
because
on what you said there.
I mean, Ramona, in more layman's terms, I would equate it to entrepreneurship. Like, an entrepreneur starts with an idea, and
Yeah.
then trying to sell that idea to the world and trying to make them believe in it. I mean, whether that person is Bill Gates or whether that person opens up a stall in your neighborhood market, they've all begun
Sure.
with an idea. you know so the same thing is writing. I mean, what are you doing? You have a vision of the world and you're trying to make the world believe in that particular vision, whether you're writing or creating art or creating music or that stuff. And that can take time to make others believe in it.
That's true. So tell me, what is the next, book that you're working on? Tell us a little bit about it. What is it based on?
There's a novel. I moved on from the 80s, so there's a novel that's
Okay.
starting in the 90s. So I've been working on it during the pandemic. There's a manuscript of short stories that has been contracted. It has been
Okay.
submitted. So
All right.
waiting for that, to come out. So basically, those are the two projects, at the
Okay.
moment. And the third project is hoping that this pandemic will finish as quickly as possible so that everything goes back to what we know as normal, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. So I thought we'll talk about, since today is the 15th of August, I thought let's, spend a few minutes talking about our nation. And, I know some of your work's been based on, political sort of themes. I
Mhm.
wanted to talk about, the middle ground and why it's important to maintain that in times like today and especially in a country like ours. So what is it that you'd
Yeah,
like to
that's what
share with us on that?
Yeah, that's what makes me fear for India. Actually, the way the middle ground is getting eroded, the way it's shrinking, and how polarized our nation is getting, in that sense. Because the moderate voice, or the
Yeah.
voice of sanity, as I call it, I mean, our history has been that when the moderate voice or the voice of sanity has been drowned out by the extreme voices, then we've had untold tragedy in this country. Because see, once the middle ground goes completely and the voice of sanity is drowned out, what have you got? You've got two angry people on the opposite sides who hate each other and are spoiling for a fight. And we've got that again and again in our history. Probably the most not probably the most tragic part was, of course, partition, where you had
Sure.
untold suffering, loss of life, migration, loss of capital, homes, all that kind of stuff. Since
Yeah.
then, we have had smaller conflagrations that have happened all over India, in that sense. And and our, and so I think that the need of the hour at this moment is to somehow maintain that middle ground, to somehow keep that moderate voice alive. Because you see, we are a very diverse country, we are a heterogeneous society with many different peoples. And if the moderate voice dies out, then it will be very difficult for all these different communities and peoples to coexist within one country, you know. So I think
That's
that's the
true.
need of the hour.
But don't you think that I don't know if it's only in, I don't want to get into too much of a political discussion, but maybe we can just talk a little bit about it. Do you think this is a trend that is worldwide? It's not only a trend in
No,
India, because I see
no,
similar patterns emerging in other countries. And these days, to have
no.
an opinion about something is very difficult, because if you have a certain opinion, then you get clubbed
Mm.
into a certain category. And then, there are people who oppose that. But if you don't have another particular opinion, then there are people who want to question you, why don't you think this way? So how does one maintain that middle ground?
Well, you asked about India, so I answered about India. But you're
Yeah,
right; it's
yeah,
part of a global trend. This kind of polarization. We are
yeah,
seeing
yeah,
all over the world. We are seeing it in Britain. We are seeing it in America, South America, Australia, even
yeah,
in Europe. In many places, and
sure,
it's very difficult. And these days, the thing, and it's pretty obvious that what used to be live and let live,
yeah,
has gone has become, that if you don't agree with me, I want nothing to do with you. I just want to denounce you, in
yeah,
that particular thing. So which is actually a very worrying trend. Uh, in our country, I think it is even more worrying because although we have an ancient culture, as a country we are still a young country, and our institutions are not as well established as they perhaps are in the other countries. And it's very easy for those institutions to crash or to whether it's our law, whether it's our courts, whether it's our political system, whether it can be subverted very much more easily, in our country. And on top of that, we are a very diverse society, lots of with a hierarchical culture, in that sense, which anyway, because of our hierarchical culture, it is never a good thing to question authority, out here.
yeah, true,
So,
true that.
so it depends. So if that authority, for instance, falls in the hands of people who do not believe in the basic, tenet of live and let live, then I think we are in a very difficult situation. Um, and so it's a global trend. Hopefully, it will come and people will see the wisdom of changing. You know.
Yeah, I mean, I look forward to that. I look forward to a more, balanced, more tolerant, and a place where, there should be a difference of opinion and it should be put across in a respectful way, but
Mm.
that diversity, I mean, even as a child, that is what one grew up, being proud about India, that we are a diverse nation. We have so many religions, we have so many different communities, we have so many languages, and they all coexist beautifully. And I mean, that is what India has always historically been about, at least from
Well,
the time
that's
that
the
I've been a child.
Well,
So
that's the vision. That's the vision.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but as you were saying about this thing, you see now there's an added dimension also, which is the dimension of social media, and the
yeah,
influence of social media is huge. There are so many people, especially people in the younger generation. pretty much get all their news through social media. I mean,
True.
which is news which has not been filtered out many times, has not been confirmed. It tends to be sensationalistic, and it tends
That's
to
true.
be, and instead of truth, it tends to serve a certain point of view. Even on the facts, I mean, truth is relative, I agree, but as
Yeah.
even on the facts, it's distorting them to serve a certain point of view. So that is the real worrying. This is the real worrying phenomenon out here, because a lot of how we think, how our opinions are formed, how our enmities are brought up, all that stuff depends on the information we get and how that information is important to us.
True. So Rajesh says your views on India is so apt. We are a very diverse nation, and like you mentioned, the erosion of middle ground is a serious concern. Beautifully explained, Vikram. Um, and Adya Prasad says, as you mentioned, we've been living in denial of the other person's political perspective. How do we create a holistic middle ground, keeping the diversity in mind? I think we kind of touched upon that, but is there something
Yeah.
you want to add to that?
I don't know, what I am saying is perhaps something that everyone knows in their sixth sense or in their heart. I'm not live and let live. There's nothing new about that. I'm just reiterating it. But how to take it from words and transform that into reality. I mean, that is something that you can't really climb into people's minds and into people's hearts. You
Yeah,
can't make them liberal, or you can't make them accepting. You can't do all those things to them. You can
yeah.
do your best, I think, for yourself, and try to be the best individual that you can yourself,
Yeah, I
and
mean, you
hope
can lead by example,
knock-on
right?
effect of that. Because you see, I also uh, because I also don't want to join the, God knows, in India we have too many preachers. Some of them preach from the pulpit, most of them preach from outside the pulpit, but they actually preach. There's no dearth of people willing to give advice. So I
That's
don't
true.
want I don't want to join that lot and pretend
Sure.
that I have all the answers to India's problems or the world's
Yeah.
problems. I mean, I'll be very happy if I have the answer to all my problems, to tell you the truth. But the sometimes I struggle there also. So forget about solving India's problems. But I hope that people will take a good long look at themselves and at the
Yeah.
country that we live in and the world we live in, and think to themselves that, do we want to live in such a climate, in such a world? Do we want our children to grow up and inherit such a world? Because you see, there are such huge problems in the world. Chief among them, there's a pandemic right now which is going
Sure.
on. It's already claimed so many people, and in our country the numbers are going up astronomically in the last week or so. Have been going
Yeah.
up for some time. We've screwed up the environment really badly. And in a third world country like India, we have screwed it up much more than other places. And we'll have to work a lot more to reclaim it, the whole environment. So, I mean, we've been playing around with the earth. We've been playing around with the earth resources. We have been busy fighting with each other and in our own little issues without paying much attention to these more important issues that I think. So I think
Yeah.
people should take a good long look at that and say that, perhaps our attention should be over there rather than about, all these problems that we have with each other, which we can solve perhaps by talking to each other.
Sure. Thank you for sharing that, Vikram. Ritu says, very well said, Vikram. She had made this comment a little while ago. I too believe passion and persistence is the key to achieving one's creative pursuits. And Isha says, you're so right about social media. It can be misused as well. So those were a couple of more comments here. So I've shared, I think, Vikram's Twitter handle and also his website on this particular post. So anyone who's watching this now or watches this later, do please go ahead and follow him. And I've also shared the 3 different novels that he's actually already written, and there are 2 more I think he mentioned that he's working on. So we'll be looking out for those. So, I think in the last few minutes of our discussion here today, Vikram, thank you so much for being here and taking the time out to
Thank you.
Be here and talk to me about all the different things that you've talked about so far. um, is there anything else that you'd like to say to, because I think a good part of a conversation has been about how things, at least if we keep the conversation to India, the conversation's been centered around the fact that there is a need for change, there is a need for more tolerance and more respect for other people's opinions, and we should lead by example. Is there anything that you'd like to share with the young people of today? Any advice you'd like to give them?
Well, the only advice, I'd like to give them is that, they can say, if they want to listen to me, that I can perhaps say is that one of the big lessons of my life has been that to follow, how important it is to follow a passion, to follow a dream, you know. And if you feel it deep inside your core, in your soul, then I think you have a duty to go ahead and at least try. Whether it works out or it doesn't work out is not up to you. A lot of other things have to go right. But if you don't at least try, then you don't give yourself an opportunity to achieve them. At least by making an effort, you get into the game, in a manner of speaking. And right through your life, like I tell everybody, even when it comes to writing, right through my life, I've known people who wrote better than me. But then after a year, they were so disappointed with the rejection they faced that they had quit writing. And in that year, I had continued writing and I had gotten better, from that sense. So passion must be married to persistence, and that in the end is the formula to achieve success. That's been my
I think
experience anyway.
I
Yeah.
think that's very beautifully put. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
Alia says such an enlightening and stimulating conversation, and she says she thoroughly enjoyed this. So again, Vikram, thank you so much for being here today, and continue doing the wonderful work that you are. Look forward to your 2 new novels, and continue writing, continue inspiring people with your writing. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rammona. Good
All
night.
right. Bye, Vikram. Bye bye.